Welcome back. In this video, we'll be discussing subtext and context, how they relate back to regular texts, and how all of them in combination inform our understanding of literary analysis. So to recap, a text, as we covered previously, refers to anything that can be read or analyzed. So literally, most anything can be a text. We understand that this is typically a book or a short story or poem, something written, but it can be visual. We can have visual text such as paintings, photographs, even architecture, the stage design at a concert, for example. All of these are examples of visual texts. Even people can be thought of as texts. Think about the way a person dresses or behaves, even body language. All of those signs can be interpreted, analyzed, broken down, and then yield some kind of insight or meaning that is not necessarily communicated explicitly, but is being communicated implicitly. So again, a text is anything that can be read or analyzed. That is the academic understanding of a text, which is distinct from the more colloquial meaning of text, which we would think of something as being written or as a text message. Remember also that analyze means to break down. And so this is different from something like summarize. So again, summary is restatement. So if I am summarizing a short story, for example, then I am summarizing its surface level components such as character, plot, conflict, and so on. Analysis refers to breaking down those components. And what that means is really just asking why those components exist the way they do. Why do the characters behave the way they do? Why are the characters drawn or developed the way that they are? Why does the plot proceed as it does? And so on. So analysis is about asking why in relationship to summary. So summary is comprehension. It is restating what's on the surface of a given text. Analysis is about trying to understand why the text exists or is constructed the way that it is. All right, so then let's move into subtext and context. Subtext, very quickly, to start our understanding of that, can be thought of as what we are trying to get at when we embark on an analysis of a text. And a good way of understanding this is to use a metaphor that I like to call the iceberg metaphor. The iceberg metaphor is honestly used in many different disciplines and for many different phenomena. Typically what it is you have an iceberg, say something like this, underneath the iceberg, so underneath the surface of the water, you have a significantly larger chunk of the iceberg. So this would be the top of the iceberg. Underneath it, you have a significantly larger percentage of the iceberg, somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 70 to 80, perhaps even 90% of the iceberg. So most of the iceberg is under the water, and then what we can see is on top of the water. And so typically what this means in a metaphorical sense is that there is more than meets the eye. So we can use this to understand subtext and context. We can think of what's on the surface of the water as the text. So let's pretend that this is a novel. We are analyzing a novel. Any novel works, Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a Mockingbird, etc. You slot it in here as a text. And so this is everything that we can see explicitly, everything that is communicated on the surface of the text, everything that is visible to us. And this would constitute things like plot, characters, settings, and conflicts. So everything that is communicated explicitly is the surface of the text, everything that we can see that we do not have to break down. It is the thing that is presented to us. So for example, someone who goes to a dinner party and wears a tuxedo, well, the tuxedo is part of the explicit communication. He or she is trying to look the part at the dinner party. That is being told to us. We don't have to infer anything. Again, an inference, to infer, is to draw a conclusion based on evidence. So we don't have to infer anything based on somebody wearing a tuxedo. We know evidently that he or she's wearing a tuxedo. Same thing with this case. I don't have to infer that the main character of To Kill a Mockingbird is Scout. That's made very plain through the text. What isn't made plain, for example, would be the motivation behind Scout. Wouldn't be what her symbolism is. That would be something that then relates to subtext. So subtext is what is underneath the surface of the text. And we can think of the prefix here as sub as indicating something that is underneath. Think about the word subordinate, submarine. A submarine, for example, is under the water. A subordinate is someone who is lower or underneath another in rank. So subtext is what is underneath the text. Now, that doesn't mean that the subtext is less important than the text. In many cases, the subtext is actually more important because the subtext is what we are trying to get at when we analyze. Subtext is where we usually find things like theme. It also can have relationships with style. So the theme, the lesson, the meaning, the so what of the narrative text of the novel in this case can be thought of as the subtext. The subtext is that underlying deeper meaning that the author may or may not be intentionally trying to communicate, but nonetheless is communicating it. There is always a subtext to any text. There's always a reasoning for the way that the text is either arranged or constructed. And again, analysis is about trying to break through the surface of the text to get at the subtext. An easier way to understand this is to think of that old idiom, read between the lines. We can literally think that we are looking between the lines of a book, for example, at what is underneath the words, what is hiding underneath the surface of the text, and that would be the subtext. So again, when we analyze, we are looking at plot, characters, and so on, and we are asking the question of why. Why do the characters behave this way? Why does the story end in the way that it does? Why does the conflict arrange as it is? Why are these symbols used, etc.? And that is about trying to reach subtext. And subtext, as opposed to the text, is implicit. It is not going to be stated by the author directly. There are some exceptions, sometimes in maybe a children's book or in a fairy tale or something that is more simplistic. The author will actually relay the meaning or theme or lesson of the story directly, explicitly, but usually this is not the case. The themes are more sophisticated, they're more complex. They have to be arrived at through analysis, and this makes them implicit. It is everything not being said. For instance, to take the example of the person at the dinner party again, let's say the person in the tuxedo arrives, but he is very upset, judging by his facial features. He is very laconic. He's monosyllabic. He doesn't engage in a lot of conversation. He keeps to himself. He maintains his distance from everyone else. He seems to be grumpy. He makes a lot of noise when he kicks his chair out, etc. All of those would be cues that he is not in the best of moods. He never tells us that he is. Nothing is explicitly communicating that to us. But thanks to the visual cues that he's providing us, those signs and symbols of his generally upset nature, we can infer that. All of that is implicitly communicated versus explicitly communicated. So subtext, again, is that which is underneath the text. It is usually the animating force. It is the meaning. It is the purpose that the author is trying to communicate that is not explicitly said. Now, while we're on that note, you might be wondering why an author simply doesn't just communicate the theme or meaning of a text directly. Wouldn't it be easier for the reader to understand if what was intended to be communicated was simply said clearly and plainly? And the reason for this is because, as we've seen previously, texts, especially novels, things that are creative, they tend to be more engaging. They're immersive. Their success in communication lies in their ability to get the reader to invest and relate to the characters. And it is that relationship with the characters, that empathy that the reader forms with the characters, that enables the reader to comprehend and to actually understand and internalize the message. Imagine reading a textbook. The textbook is going to explain itself very clearly and plainly, but because there is no emotional association or resonance with the textbook, usually, the reader has less of a chance of actually internalizing and learning anything. This is why people read often an essay or a textbook, and they don't actually internalize. They flip the page and and realize that they didn't learn anything, that they didn't absorb any of the information on the prior page. Why is that? Because there is no emotional connection. The reader in a creative text, such as a short story or a novel or in a platonic dialogue or whatever the case is, has more of a tendency to actually absorb the information and internalize the different themes and complex ideas because he or she is engaged in them, immersed in them. There is a vicarious experience that is ongoing. The characters experience things in the plot. The reader experiences those things by proxy. The reader then absorbs or to some degree experiences the same stimuli as the characters, and therefore learns the same lessons, if not similar ones. And so this is why analysis can be very useful, right? Analysis helps us understand and clarify what the meaning of the events of the novel, the experiences of the characters mean to the reader, clarifies it, and also helps us understand better about what the author is trying to communicate. Now, context is distinct from subtext. So we have text, subtext, and now we have context. So if text is the surface of the iceberg, subtext is what is underneath the iceberg, what is part of the iceberg, but is simply not visible to the naked eye. Context would be that which surrounds the iceberg. And so this is a little more abstract. The metaphor doesn't lend itself to this as easily as it does subtext. But think of context as all of the different factors that inform the creation of a text. So we have talked about before that an author is a text, himself or herself, and the author produces the text. So we start with text on the bottom, author, and then the author is produced by a context. Now, what informs an author's context? This could be a variety of things: upbringing, politics, religion, culture, society, geography, and so on. The list is truly endless when it comes to what can define a person. So when we think about context, what we need to consider are what the different factors are that inform the creation of a text. So for example, if Harper Lee is writing To Kill a Mockingbird, what is informing her creation of To Kill a Mockingbird? Well, obviously, it's part of her childhood experiences living in the South. It's her understanding and perspective on racism, on racial segregation in the South, on the dynamic between white and Black in that region. And all of that is going to inform the creation of the text. Without her having been raised in that particular environment at that particular time in history, she would not have produced To Kill a Mockingbird. And so context are all of the factors, whatever they may be, political, social, cultural, religious, geographic, that lead to a writer or any artist really being the way he or she is, and that contribute to he or she creating the text that they do. So the text is relying on the author is relying on context. When we engage in literary analysis, it's very important that we consider context when we think about why an author intended certain things via plot or character. Some schools of thought, some modes of literary analysis actually reduce the amount of context. In a future video, we'll discuss this as part of literary theory. But I would emphasize very strongly that if you are engaging in kind of general literary analysis, and this is something that you are practicing especially for a class in high school or in college, considering the historical, cultural, political, etc. context of the author is paramount to understanding his or her intentions with the text, or even just understanding the unintentional nature of a text. Authors don't have to consider including or embedding certain themes in texts. It just happens naturally, right? The author sort of produces the text, and the text, just by nature of being a product of the author, carries with it a lot of that context that informed the author's life. So to summarize, the text is the thing that we are analyzing. In the case of literary analysis, it's a piece of literature, usually a novel, a short story, a poem, or a play. Subtext is that which is underneath the surface of the text, and that is the thing that we are trying to get at when we do analysis. So when we ask questions about a text's use of figurative language, about an author's development of certain characters, or about the structuring or pacing of a certain plot, where you're asking analytical questions that are designed to get at the subtext. The subtext is, again, the underlying meaning and implicit message of the text. The context is that which surrounds the text and the author and informs its creation as well as the author's life. Hopefully you have some greater clarity about these three terms, how they interrelate, and how they contribute to your understanding of literary analysis. Join me in the next video in which we talk about intertextuality and elaborate on the ways that texts actually influence one another.